I'm Scott Al Miller. It's the 3rd of December, 2023. This is my vlog of daily life living in Leon, Nicaragua. Today I'm going to be talking about how everything you hear about everywhere you're going to look for relocating or moving or traveling or just understanding the world is an anecdote, and how you need to deal with that, because the information that you're going to get from any source is going to be very difficult for you to use. And there's a lot of things you need to consider when just thinking about how you're looking at investigating the rest of the world. We're also going to talk about some temperatures throughout Latin America and a little bit about toxicity in your previous life. We're going to get to all that right after the bump. I bring up the topic of toxicity because, you know, in living abroad, something that I've noticed, and I think a lot of people will notice, and I could be wrong, which we'll get to about the anecdotes in a little bit, but I think a lot of people deal with this, is that when you move abroad, you tend to experience a lot of toxicity from your home country, your past life, whatever. And there's a lot of reasons for this, I think. And one of them, I believe, is that in moving to a lot of places, regardless of where you go, you have a tendency to move from, and this is just a general thing, right? There's certainly exceptions, but I believe most people move from places that are very high stress, high cost, whatever, and they tend to move to places that are much more relaxed and low cost and low stress. And there's a natural moving from toxicity away from toxicity that we don't really think about, but being in a high cost, high stress place has a tendency to engender a lot of toxicity in life. And when you move away and you start getting into a life where you don't have a lot of that, experiencing it somewhere else is much more obvious. Things that maybe you put up with or thought were normal in your previous life, when you move to somewhere new, is suddenly like, oh my gosh, that's not what I want around me anymore. And there's a group online that I've been a member of, just a chat group for many years, literally pushing a decade. And today there was an argument about things between the US and Nicaragua, and they had some points, but the manner in which it was approached was so toxic, so bullying, so Americans are right and no one else gets to have an opinion, and look, I can pull up this one piece of information from an unverified source and it supports my xenophobic worldview, so everyone else is wrong, and America needs all this free pass on stuff. Like, it was very, very just exactly what I remember from my life in America, but had not pinpointed until I was really seeing that. I'm like, you know what? I'm not going to have this discussion. I don't need to. I'm not going to convince someone who is like that they should, you know, open their eyes and visit somewhere else in the world. I'm not going to convince them to consider people from other linguistic backgrounds or cultural backgrounds as having the same value as them. This is someone I know from past experiences is very waving the Confederate flag and things, and it's just, they're not someone who's very likely to take a discussion and say, oh, there's value I should get from this and grow from it. They're really just looking to pick a fight, and anyone who doesn't support their worldview, they're going to yell at. I realized this toxicity and that there was no benefit to me in being there. There was no reason for me to be a part of this group. And really, I was just there to be a punching bag. And I'll be fair, there's quite often that I'm a little bit like gung-ho on Central America and life abroad, and sometimes that rubs people the wrong way, and I can be very aggressive online or feel that way. I know that sounds crazy from people who watch my show. For the most part, I'm pretty laid back when you watch a show, and you'll be like, wow, Scott, I wouldn't have guessed. I've got something in my shirt. And the reality is I don't actually tend to be very aggressive online. It's that I have a tone that when you don't know me and you read it can often sound pretty aggressive. That's not to say I'm never aggressive. I've definitely gotten into online fights with people, but it's a funny story. I was once at a conference and there was a guy that we had apparently a lot of arguments, and he was talking to my wife because she used to go to a lot of conferences with me, and he's like, oh, I'd kind of like to meet him, but we've had some pretty heated debates, and I don't think it would be a very friendly thing. And my wife's like, are you kidding? He probably isn't aware you had an online fight. Like, you probably were having a discussion, you were making points, he was making points, and it's just, you know, trying to look for truth. He doesn't really, under normal circumstances, take it as like an argument. In this case today, it really felt like there was a bullying situation, right? He was trying to browbeat me and he wasn't trying to argue with me, right? That's a key difference. It was very clear he was trying to shout me down so that other people reading what was being said would see it as me not caving in to his points, but he wasn't making points that would make any sense to me. If he was trying to make points to me, he wouldn't be telling me things that were demonstrably not true by looking out the window, right? Lying about or proposing the fact that something isn't true in Nicaragua when I'm here. And he's like, no, I found an article from an American that says this thing isn't true. So therefore the things that you observe in Nicaragua, even though I know you directly, aren't true. Which is very often his argument for things, right? It'll be, oh, I can pull an anecdote from a person. I don't even know if it's a real person. It could be a bot. And that's more valuable to me than the word of someone I know who's there firsthand observing something. And this could be technical, business, all kinds of things. Had nothing to do with life in Nicaragua. The fact that today's argument was about Nicaragua really just highlighted to me, oh, wait, it's toxic. There's no reason to be here. So back to this story, this guy was at this conference and he's like, okay, I guess I'll meet him. And then we ended up being like, oh my gosh, yes, we talked online. Like, and he's like, I felt like we were going to have all this animosity. I'm like, from what? And he's like, oh, like it wasn't even a thing. Like I have no idea what he thinks we argued about so many years ago. But so generally I am pretty chill, but a lot of people take me as being aggressive, mostly because I often have a contradictory opinion. Partially because I spend time thinking about things. I'm willing to travel to places that people don't normally go. I actually look into technology. I don't just take the word of vendors. This is a big thing in business, right? Tons of people just take marketing material and repeat it. And when you do that, it feels like the world agrees with you, but when you're actually researching things, generally all that stuff is false, right? If a company says we have the best car you could possibly get, chances are it's not a good car. Chances are the best vehicle is something completely different that isn't advertising. It's just hoping people that really care will do research and buy their vehicle. And in technology, there is, if you're working in IT, 9 times out of 10, the best answer is something free. It's not, you don't have to go out and buy something. You don't have to do what the vendor says. You don't have to do something complicated. Often there's a very simple, very straightforward, very free solution that is better, way better than all those things, but there's no one making money pushing it. And so the people who care are out there doing those things, and everyone else is just like, what do I buy? They don't ask, what do I do? What's the best way to solve this problem? What's the best way to make my business run? They just go, what do I buy? And so they get the same answer, which isn't a good answer, but it feels good because all the people who are making money are all willing to repeat it, and they're all corroborating each other. And so that kind of stuff tends to make me sound like I'm aggressive because I'm willing to defend the unpopular opinion because I'm looking for the truth, not a quick buck. And so that's a big thing. So a lot of people take me as being aggressive only because I'm actually arguing for truth. And when you're arguing for defending an undefendable position, the truth feels aggressive. All right, before we start talking about the weather across Latin America, which I think is really important based on my trip to Bolivia recently, and you guys need to stick around for that, I want to talk about how everything is an anecdote. I still have a bit of this cough, but it's getting better. I'm not going to die on you, but I am still coughing a bit. But the last 2 to 3 days have been pretty bad. Today is just like, oh, you can tell that it's getting better, but it's still lingering. I think tomorrow, possibly the day after, should be fine. Okay. So when you're looking at moving abroad, and this is true for a lot of things in life, like I said, I come from an IT background, and tons of stuff in IT is like this. Almost everything you will learn about a place is anecdotal. This may seem crazy. We always say don't listen to anecdotes, and that's not exactly true. What you shouldn't do is take anecdotes as statistics, but anecdotes are often your only source of information for a lot of things, and I'll give some examples. When we're talking about power outages here in Nicaragua or cell phone coverage, what there aren't are statistics. We have no way to know how many houses have lost power for how much time and over what frequency. Obviously, you don't care about a weekend, you care about like a year or a 10-year period. something large, and you want big statistical numbers like you have a 0.1% chance on any given day of some amount of outage, and the average amount of time that you'll be out for a year is 3 hours, right? Not 3 hours per time. Throughout the course of the year, you'll have lost 3 hours of power time. And of course, there's more that goes into it than that. Was it in the middle of the night? Is it the middle of the day? Does it affect work? Is it at a time that's not very inconvenient and barely do I notice, right? If it's only on a Sunday at 1 a.m. and it's all 3 hours at once, sure, that's one night without air conditioning for 3 hours in the middle, but your room's already cold. You're probably already in bed. You may not even wake up. When you do, the power's already kicking back on, and it doesn't matter at all. Or is it happening in little chunks all throughout the year at exactly the moment that you're trying to do an important meeting over and over again, and it really impacts your life even though the time is still 3 hours? What matters varies a lot, and it requires a lot of details. But when we're just trying to get the most basic statistics, like does the US have more reliable power than Nicaragua, we have no way to know. This is important. We literally don't have a way to know. I can tell you that my experiences have been that Nicaragua's power outages are less impactful to me than my American outages. That I can tell you. I've never had the panics in Nicaragua. I can't even fathom having the panics in Nicaragua that I've had multiple times in the United States. But that's anecdotal. That's only me. Now, I know a few other people who've had that, so it's slightly more than just anecdotal, but it's essentially still anecdotal. It's anything but statistical. I can extrapolate from that. I know that millions of people at any given time in the United States have certain outages that get reported on the news, but there could be really big outages here in Nicaragua that are not being reported. It'd be unlikely, as I know people throughout the country and everybody talks about those things, but it could certainly happen. And it wouldn't need to be millions. If it was 10,000 people somewhere without power, no one might report that. I might not know someone in that zone, and that would be statistically meaningful in the same way as a million people in the United States, just because the country's so much smaller. Maybe not quite that dramatic, but basically those kinds of numbers. And understanding how those outages work, really getting statistics, like it really is hard to compare. I can tell you for certain, my experience here in Nicaragua is that power outages happen more often, but are extremely short and rarely impactful. And in the United States, they were very rare, but when they did happen, they tended to be long and very impactful most of the time, or much more often. But I can't tell you if the same thing holds true in all different parts of Nicaragua, or all parts of Nicaragua now, right? When I lived in Grenada 8 years ago, we had more power outages more frequently than we do here in Leon. That was 8 years ago. I don't know if Grenada is still like that today. Any number of things may have changed. I don't know if Managua is like that. I certainly don't know if San Juan del Sur or Esteli are like that, let alone Bluefields or Puerto Cabeza. And you need to take all those things into consideration. But likewise, if you're looking at the United States, you have to look over huge areas to really get the same comparison. And how do you do that? Right? It becomes very difficult. And neither the US nor Nicaragua are providing statistics on that. So it's not like you can go look it up and have a comparative number. You are literally stuck with anecdotes being roughly the only thing you have to work with. You can make some estimates based on weather and patterns and how things work and just whatever. And for the most part, you're stuck with anecdotes. It's the only tool we have. This is unfortunate, but we have to work with it. What brought this up specifically was the toxic conversation that I had had. We were talking about power, and he immediately pulled up a person that we knew was not known for their honesty, who wrote that power in Nicaragua was not that good. And I'm not saying they were being dishonest about this particular thing. I'm just saying in general, we have had direct dealings with them, and honesty is not one of their things. And they're known very much here for being a dishonest person in the country. And they have this article that is not current that says that power is not good in Nicaragua. And this is important because we'll assume that they're telling the truth from their perspective. We have to understand their context. And his context is he's Canadian and he lives in a small village, and the article was old. So let's say 3 years, maybe it's only a 3 years old article. 3 years ago, the power in a small village in Nicaragua was not up to the standards he was used to in Canada. This is difficult because I don't know how Canada ranks in general compared to the United States. Yes, I spent a lot of time in Canada, but not enough to have some kind of power distribution perspective to give on that. So Canada may be way better than the US, maybe the same, maybe way worse. They do have a lot of snow, so they have some challenges that the United States doesn't have statistically. But he could be coming from a very isolated part of Canada that has amazing power. Maybe he's coming from a part that's really bad, but he is only looking at, and I know he's only looking at, a very isolated part of Nicaragua that is extremely remote and very small. He's not talking about a city. He's not talking about the general population. He's not talking about a part of the country that we generally think about as being part of the country. And so when he uses that as his context to say that the power distribution isn't that great, is he comparing that to a small village in Canada or even the United States? Probably not. I don't know that he's not, but probably not. And so that one piece from him, we'll assume it's true. We'll assume his experience is that the power is not as good, even though my experience is that the power is better, and say, but it's still, in both of our cases, just the context. Maybe I come from parts of the US where it was not as good as average, and maybe he's in a part of Nicaragua where it's not as good as average, and all you have as not us and not in our exact situations is our examples of that. And you can gain a couple more people, and you can extrapolate some things like, well, importantly, the power is not that bad, but it's also not perfect, right? That's pretty much guaranteed. But can you come up with a meaningful number after doing all of that that really gives you a way to gauge, say, the US or Canada versus Nicaragua? No, you do not, and you never will. There's very unlikely to ever be a manner for doing that, or the tools for doing that, or the information to do that. And even if you had a whole bunch of statistics, would those statistics be meaningful? Would you be including areas where no one cares that the power is out? Would you be looking at the time of day or the way that the power goes out? Does it go out suddenly? Does it brown out? All kinds of things. It's a complex thing. And when I come from IT backgrounds, we deal with some of these things. Right, we say, what is it's a little bit different. We're not comparing statistics, but we may be looking at what the risk is of a power outage. And we say, well, if it's just a transformer blowing, it's just as likely to blow in the middle of the night as the middle of the day. Maybe that's not true, but it's roughly true. And so during these hours, we don't care so much. And during these hours, we care a lot. Here, we only have to worry about the risk during these hours, and so forth. It gets really complex. And so when you're dealing with anecdotal evidence for everything, right, whether it's safety or quality of food or availability of transport or the cost of something, everything's just an anecdote. And that's where real estate becomes very difficult in Nicaragua. In the United States, you're able to have statistical information about the American real estate market and the Canadian real estate market, but in Nicaragua, you do not. It's only anecdotal. That's an underlying thing. I don't think we've ever said that before, but that is why the knowledge of the Nicaraguan market is so hard. It is purely anecdotal. There is no time that you have enough information to go beyond that here. And in the US you do, and that gives the US a bunch of power in real estate that Nicaragua doesn't have and causes a bunch of confusion. People coming here are sure that we must also have that statistical information, but they're not thinking through the fact that we're too small of a market, everything's too disparate, and where would those statistics come from? They can't exist. They don't exist, right? It's not like someone's hiding them. It's not like some government has them and not telling us. It's not like they could be collected if someone just knew how to do it. They don't exist in the first place, and so you can't just pull them out of nowhere. And so that's a really tough thing. And this is not just about the US and Nicaragua, it's just an example here, right? And it's just, and we also talked about cell phone coverage, right? And we're like, okay, my experience here is that my cell phone's much better, and everyone there is like, oh, my cell phone sucks. Here we're like, cell phones are great, right? But does that give us real statistical information to compare? No, it's still anecdotal. It might be a little bit better, several anecdotes, but it's just several anecdotes. And where you are in both places matters a lot. How you use your phone in both places mattered a lot. One of the things they were talking about is how cell phones are dropping calls in the United States, but no one makes cell phone calls in Nicaragua. So the way that it handles the same signal will be completely different. And so how do you compare those? You can't. It's different things. And so you can say, well, the experience with cell phones here is pretty routinely a good one, and that in the United States, people are pretty routinely unhappy with their phones. But that's not telling us a whole lot, and certainly not a comparative mechanism. The thing that brought about the initial conversation that ended up being toxic and causing me to leave the group permanently was that someone had posted about the decline of cell service in the United States, how as the density of the United States went up, the quality of cell service was going down. They weren't expanding the cell networks at the same rate that the population was expanding, and so because of that, these cell services were becoming overrun. Even though they had more customers and more scale, theoretically they should not have those problems. They're failing to keep up with the demand, and so the quality of the actual cell service was going down over time. People had noticed this anecdotally. Now they were starting to collect statistics on it. It was a big deal. Here in Nicaragua, are not aware of that problem. We're continuing to grow our cell service. Our population is not expanding the same, and we keep getting better and better service. We also just found out we're getting real 5G, not what places market as 5G. We actually have actual 5G. Those are different things. I work with telecom providers in the United States, and 5G last we saw was not authorized in the United States. It requires some information. It requires some IP from China that the U.S. has not authorized for deployment on the telephony systems in the United States. And so the U.S. has to call other things 5G because they're not allowed to have real 5G. But because of that, because they market 5G, of course, people in the U.S. will be like, we've had 5G, we've had it for a long time, it's great. And then they'll quote speeds and things that aren't related to the generation of the technology as reasons for why they have it, which really should highlight that they never even checked on it at all. They don't even know what it is. They're just quoting something random. In the US, they actually passed laws to protect the American public by not requiring companies to be honest about the generation of telecommunications equipment that they put in, because so many people were confused by it and wanted it to mean something it didn't. And so they're not required to be honest about it. So everyone just says whatever they want, and more or less. So Americans generally believe they have 5G, even though they do not at all. In most cases, they're still on 3G, which is not a bad thing. It works just fine. And if it meets the needs, which it clearly is not currently in the US, hence the problem, but it's, as long as it's meeting the needs, what G you're on doesn't matter. That's a misconception. But because people think it matters, they started working around having it actually be designated what it actually is. This is very confusing, but needless to say, here in Nicaragua, we're actually getting 5G from China. It's real. It is not a marketing term. It is actual 5G, much like cloud is a very specific thing in IT, but for people who aren't in IT, they like to have the word cloud because they've heard that it's really cool and it's a new technology, which is ridiculous. It's 20 years old, which is very, very, very old in the technology world. But people feel like they're supposed to have cloud, and so everyone has come up with ways to use the word to mean something that isn't cloud, or sometimes it's cloud but not always, and people are happy getting to use the word because that's all they cared about. They didn't actually care that they got cloud. Same thing with 5G. What people actually want is speed and reliability and latency, or low latency, and as long as they're getting that, they don't actually care that they don't have it via 5G. 5G is just one way that they hoped they'd be able to get it. Was that confusing? Probably. But that's what prompted the conversation, was that we have this really good cell service here that is improving as 5G was just approved here, just acquired, and in the US, statistically, it is declining. And having lived in both places and taking my phone back and forth, my impression, anecdotally, is that I get better service at lower cost here in Nicaragua. I am consistently, completely happy with my cell service, except for the Ponaloya Road, where there's a huge gap, but there's no houses at all, so what are you going to do? But other than that, very happy with the coverage throughout the entire country. I can drive really far across the country. I never have to worry about dropping service. I never have to worry about things not working. I'm always able to bring up a map, and I'm able to do so at $12 a month for my service, and I'm able to use my phone heavily in ways I would never be able to use in the United States. That makes me happy. When I go to the US, my phone still works. It's okay, but I have areas without coverage, things are spotty, and the service is just not as good. So my anecdotal evidence is that my experience here in Nicaragua is better. Everyone I know says that they have the same experience, that they feel like the price goes down significantly and the quality goes up marginally when being here. But again, the number of people I know is not enough to actually be statistical. All right, enough of that. We're going to talk about weather and climate throughout Latin America, because this is what you're really here for. So thank you for sticking around. And if you have a moment, I encourage you, if you're interested in supporting the channel, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Scott Allen Miller. That makes this show possible. And take a moment to hit like and subscribe to the channel if you have not done so. And of course, tell your friends and family about the show. Post this link somewhere while I'm talking. And as always, scroll down there, leave your comments, whether it's about cell phones or power, climate, but let's get right into it. When I was in Bolivia recently, this is just 2 weeks ago, one of the things that I got a lot of responses from you guys on is, oh my gosh, it looks so cool. Meaning fresh and relaxing, and like the weather is just fantastic. It's kind of dry and not that hot. And people said, does it really never get hot? No, it really never does. I guess there could be a day here and there, but Cochabamba, La Paz, these are not hot cities. If you saw the videos of Santa Cruz, it gets hot. This does not apply to Santa Cruz. Santa Cruz is a crazy hot city. But the other cities, the ones in the mountains that we showed in Bolivia, they are very pleasant weather, getting down to kind of cold year round. So they do have a bit of variation, but they are never hot. That is one thing that just doesn't happen. I was there during a record-setting heat wave, and I wouldn't call it hot. I was wearing a shirt kind of like this one in specific probably. I had jeans on, I had sneakers on, I had a hat on, and walking around, I was just the tiniest bit chilly, not sweating. It was very comfortable. I liked it a lot. It's also dry, so it doesn't have to get super cold to cool it down. Here, we're not super humid, but we are on the humid side, and so everything feels a little bit warmer than it actually is. When we hit, say, 90, it feels like 92, which is fine, not a big deal. I do wish it was a little bit drier. I do prefer that. Being in Bolivia, when you hit 90, it feels like 85. It's actually very dry, and so your body cools down very easily. You also need to drink a lot of fluids. You will dehydrate without realizing it, so always keep that in mind. The reason that I bring this up is not to point out how wonderful the weather is in Bolivia, although fantastic it is. What really hit me is how much people were surprised that there were great options that were not as hot as Nicaragua. So I want to talk about this a little bit. So very specifically, there are two countries. Now, before I go into this, it is dangerous to talk about countries when it comes to climate. Some countries like Nicaragua and Panama are so small that we're able to generalize about their climate. But other countries like Mexico or Colombia or Brazil especially are so large that you cannot. And so you want to be very careful, because if you start talking about which countries are hot or cold, it can be very misleading. So I'm going to do my best to give you some context, and we'll be as little anecdotal as possible and try to stick to statistics. But here we go. Nicaragua and Panama set themselves apart as the hottest countries in the Western Hemisphere and in Latin America. So if you're looking at, so we're going to assume that the reaction I'm getting from you guys is that you're interested in what Nicaragua seems to have. And a lot of that, yes, some of it's just Nicaragua, it's fantastic, but some of it is Latin America. Latin America is a great potential destination for a lot of people. Travel, relocation, digital nomadry, whatever. It's a really good area for a lot of things, for a lot of reasons. And that's one of the reasons that we like Nicaragua so much. It's in the middle of Latin America, and it gives us access to a lot of things, and it has a lot of the general Latin American checkboxes. So that's a starting point for one of the reasons why we like Nicaragua so much. Nicaragua and Panama, we're the hot ones. We're at sea level, and we're not that far away from the equator. We're a little ways away, but we're not super far. So we have that incredible year-round tropical weather. That's never going to go away in either country. You might find an isolated mountain peak where you can get just a little bit cooler, but that's all you're getting. We don't have high mountains, and we don't have vast amounts of land in which to put those mountains. So you're mostly going to get this very hot experience. León is a little bit hotter than most of Nicaragua, but only by a little bit. When people say, oh, it's so hot in León, they don't mean it's a completely different place. They mean it's a few degrees warmer. And trust me, that makes a difference, but it's not completely changing the game. If you're coming to Nicaragua, you are coming for warmth. Even if you're going to Jinotega, up in the highest mountains, it's very pleasant, but it's always going to lean towards the warm side. If you're looking for the experience that you have here or in Panama, both are wonderful countries that I've lived in and love a lot. You have a number of options that are not very far away, and so give you a lot of the same cultural advantages, or the same time zone advantages, or the same airline advantages, or whatever, some of those factors that are going to overlap. You have Costa Rica sitting between them. Costa Rica is the majority of the country is somewhat elevated in the mountains. Not all of the country. You have hot parts. Wow, hot parts, just like Nicaragua and Panama, but you also have San Jose, for example, which is very high in the mountains and has a much more pleasant climate than most of the area around it. And that could make Costa Rica a good option for you if what you're looking for is that cooler weather. But we have to be aware that Costa Rica has a very different culture than the surrounding countries. It is much more Americanized, it speaks a lot more English, has a lot more chains and large businesses, and it costs a lot more. So some of the things you may love about Nicaragua, like it's cheap, may not apply in Costa Rica. But to the north of Nicaragua, you have Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. These all share a lot of culture and history with Nicaragua. They're also physically quite close. For me, here to Honduras is only about 2 hours, and only a few minutes more if I wanted to get to where I could see El Salvador. It takes a little bit longer to actually get there because that would require a ferry that isn't actually running, so you're more likely looking at a rowboat, and that's not fast. But the actual physical border to El Salvador is not far away either. So given that these places are so close, they share a lot with Nicaragua, but what they don't share is that they are super low lying at ocean level. they actually have quite a bit of average elevation, and both countries have an average climatic change of being quite a bit cooler, and both will at times experience snow at their highest points. All of them have a cost of living that is extremely similar to Nicaragua, probably all higher. But those are big averages. If you found a small village or just got a good deal on an apartment, maybe you change what you eat just slightly, you may find them to be essentially the same. Of course, you're making a little bit of change there, but basically it's the same. And you don't need air conditioning up there in most cases. So if you found it a little bit warm here, you were thinking you're going to use air conditioning, going up there, you may spend more on everything, but not needing air conditioning might make up the difference. So if you're looking for things that you see in my videos and you say, Scott, Nicaragua looks fantastic, I love it, I don't know if I can take that heat. And some of you know who you are. This is a real conversation I've had with people. You may need to take a serious look at the three countries to the north of us, the Triangle as they are known. They are all very interesting countries. They all have a lot to offer. They're all full of really nice, wonderful people. They all have great food, and they all are very similar in the grand scheme of things to Nicaragua. There's a good chance that one of them will have a village, a city, or something that is going to meet your needs in the way that Nicaragua would, but at similar cost, similar transport, similar logistics, and a much cooler temperature. So unless you're looking for oceanfront, if you want to be on the beach, then everyone's temperatures are basically the same. We're just not far enough apart from each other for that to be very different once you get to sea level. You can find small variations. They're mostly pretty small. And a lot of the things you see here, if you like Leon, there are other cities in all these countries that may meet your needs in a very similar way, but could be much cooler. So I suggest you take a look there, and I think a lot of people may be surprised that there are these great options very nearby at completely different climatic situations. Just that seems to be something people aren't aware of. And I understand, coming from the United States, I grew up always believing that Central America was very hot and tropical, that Mexico was very hot and basically a desert for most of it, and none of that is true. Most of Latin America, let me say this, most of all of Latin America is incredibly mild, at least where the people live. It is unbelievable how nice so much of the climate is throughout this enormous zone. The United States and Canada actually have some of the world's harshest weather. This is something that growing up in America, I had no idea. I always thought that our weather was actually very nice, partially because it's what I was used to. But the idea that you had 4 seasons, of course, everyone has 4 seasons, right? No, tons of people don't. It gets really hot in the summer and really cold in the winter, right? No, there's tons of places where that's not true. So many places have really nice, mild weather compared to what I grew up with in the Northeast, compared to the Midwest, compared to much of the South. The west of the United States starts to get much better weather in general. There's a reason why people flock to California and Oregon, but they still don't have the absolute best weather, but they're pretty good. But in much of Latin America, you're getting those kinds of climatic advantages over a massive area that costs very little. So if you've been thinking, well, Latin America is going to be really hot, maybe it's something that doesn't work for you, you're probably looking at a very few isolated places, and Nicaragua happens to be one of the larger ones that's all together, and Panama is also a very popular place to look at. These give you that, whoa, it's so hot, I don't know if I can do it, all at once. And you may not realize that even the space in between them is mild, the space right next to them is mild on every side. If you go anywhere from either country, you're immediately in milder climates. Colombia to the east of Panama, Costa Rica in the middle, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador to the north, all of them pretty nice. Now, we mentioned Honduras and El Salvador. Guatemala is even milder still. It is the land of eternal spring. That is what it is known as. It has higher mountains than the rest of the countries in the region, and so most of the population is pretty high in the mountains, so it gets a few more degrees cooler than even El Salvador. This means that if you're looking for a really mild temperature, maybe even jeans and a jacket a lot of the time, Guatemala may meet your needs. And again, similar food, culture, history, and everything else in Nicaragua. So if you like what you're seeing here, but you want it to be fleece weather, you may have an option without leaving the region. If you go farther north, most of Mexico, I know it has a really famous reputation, especially in the north, of being super hot. And this is for a lot of reasons. Its border with the United States, Nuevo Laredo and Tijuana and places like that, are very hot. They're also very small parts of the Mexican population. Most of the Mexican population lives in the mountains in the center of the country, and it's a very large mountain range. So this is a giant area. But most of the major cities and the bulk of the population live at very high elevation and have beautiful temperatures. You may not like other things. Maybe you don't like the traffic, the smog, or the way you move between cities, or the cost of living in Mexico City. But if weather is what you're concerned about, Mexico may easily meet your needs. And there's lots of the country that's extremely safe. There's definitely bad bits, so you have to be a little bit more careful in Mexico than a lot of other countries, because you need to know where you're going to be going. You can't just go absolutely anywhere and assume it's going to be safe, but most of the places that you would go are pretty safe. You also have the Yucatan. This is a peninsula in southeastern Mexico that is very hot. Whether it's Cancun or Merida or other cities in the region, they're very, very hot. Some of the hottest in all of Mexico, and a lot of Americans and Canadians travel there for vacations, and so experience super hot regions there as well, and come back thinking that most of Mexico is going to be like this. But again, Mexico City, very mild. Puebla, quite mild. Guadalajara, very mild. Guanajuato, very mild. Lots of options that are big cities, small villages, all kinds of things with beautiful weather. So don't rule out Mexico as well. And that gives us all of North and Central America for Latin America right there, with really great climate options, with just a few exceptions that are really warm. And don't get me wrong, I love it here. The warmth is not a problem for a lot of us, but for a lot of people it is. And I know a lot of my audience certainly looks at it and goes, I love everything except this weather, and I don't want you to give up or feel that you don't have an option just because Nicaragua doesn't meet your climatic needs. There really are options for you. You just need to broaden your horizons a little bit. And I'm sorry that I haven't been to all those places and made tons of videos. I would love to. Few things sound more exciting to me than making videos across Latin America, other than snuggling my dogs at night. That's my big thing, right? But other than that, I really do want to get around and take videos in all these places and help bring them to you in the same way we do here in Nicaragua. I haven't been able to do that, but don't feel that there aren't options for you just because I'm not showing them. I know that we make Nicaragua look really attractive on this show, and it doesn't take much work because it really is. But there's a lot of really great stuff out there that you can experience as well. And that's, I think, what people were seeing in my Bolivia videos. This was another country like Nicaragua that people know absolutely nothing about in general, right? And I didn't know much about it when I went. A bit, of course, but not nearly as much as I learned when I was there. But seeing this colder weather and realizing that all these things they like about Latin America may exist with great weather was shocking. So in South America, we actually have a lot more of these options. Now, of course, we got some really hot ones. Brazil gets really hot, and the majority of South America is in Brazil. But Brazil has really mild regions as well. I don't know all the cities and different states of Brazil. I would love to spend a bunch of time exploring it, but it does have options at every temperature range, from cold to outrageously hot. And Bolivia has a very big range as well, as does Peru. Lima is pretty warm, but Cusco and some of the other cities get pretty high in the mountains, and you can get pretty cold in Peru. Colombia has the majority of its population at extreme altitude. It's very mild. If you watch TV from Colombia, people are wearing coats and jeans and boots all the time because it's quite chilly. They're at extreme altitude. Venezuela doesn't have the same level of altitude as Colombia, and so it's a bit warmer, but is still not, for the most part, super warm. It's just not as extreme as Colombia. As you come south a little bit, you have Ecuador, and Ecuador has Guayaquil, which is closer to the water, so warmer, and Quito, which is more famous, and its capital, and is much cooler, very high in the mountains. Again, extremely high, much more like La Paz. Cusco and Quito and La Paz are kind of the extreme examples of super high cities in South America. When you get down to Chile and Argentina, many of their big cities don't use the mountains. They're just very far south, and so they're much more like a New York or a Washington, D.C. as far as their climate, because they're so far from the equator. So you get mild down there as well, but you also get the seasons. In Uruguay, you have a similar situation. Montevideo is right by Buenos Aires. In Paraguay, you have warmer as you get lower down in the middle of the country at Asunción. But throughout South America, you have options that are mild, either with or without the seasons, either in the mountains or in the valleys, on the oceans or not. You have a lot of different things, and you can get all the way down to Ushuaia, some of the coldest places where you're going to have major populations. So you have a big range. But what's almost universal, and certainly there's exceptions, but almost universal, is that the populations of Central and South America and Mexico, the Latin American countries, almost all live in very mild temperatures. And as Americans, and for lots of reasons, we picture Latin America as just very, very warm. And this is rarely true. It's amazing how many places in Latin America, including ones very close to the equator, never hit the temperatures that I grew up with in New York. I was used to hitting 100 degrees, not every summer, but regularly, and in the high 90s every year. Summers were hot, and then not that much longer after that, and you'd have snow. And that adjustment is difficult. It is very unlikely to find anything like that in Latin America. You're going to find places that hit maybe the mid 90s, but more likely the low 90s, and that in winter don't go down to loads of snow, but go down to 40 or 50 degrees. And some places are just the same year round, especially those near the equator. So for those of you who are shocked or have never thought about just how mild the climate is, I think it's time to look more broadly at that, and then certainly get down there with your questions. I want to know what you're interested in and what you're just realizing. But you have some really mild stuff all over the place. It's worth investigating. Don't feel that you're trapped with the hot places. You've got options that may really expand your worldview and give you just wonderful places you may want to go. But be aware, if you're going to be on the ocean, you're very limited. There's only so many places that are going to have colder ocean front. And a lot of people do want that. And so that drives a lot of people to Nicaragua and Panama, where we have a lot of that. And it's just warm anyway, so it's all about the same. Thanks for joining me. Like and subscribe. As always, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/ScottAlanMiller. Post online, tell your friends, and I will see all of you tomorrow.